Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Star Wars film, as George Lucas envisioned, probably was never supposed to grow into a large franchise. Even George Lucas was surprised by how successful the first movie was. He actually reveals this in an interview in 2015 with Stephen Colbert at the Tribeca Film Festival. He claimed that the only person who believed that Star Wars would be a huge hit was Steven Spielberg. Spielberg really knows his stuff. Now, when Star Wars premieres, George Lucas is actually on his way to Hawaii. He wants a little bit of R&R after a very grueling shoot. It was only after an executive from 20th Century Fox called him telling him that the movie was extremely successful that he realized what he had in his hands. And so while George Lucas did have a plan, or at least an outline, for the original trilogy, no one could have predicted what would follow. An expanded universe of almost endless amounts of content and new lore. As a matter of fact, other than the Old Testament, I think Star Wars is like the first mega franchise that completely exploded in popularity and then was expanded upon by multiple authors with all sorts of different interpretations, viewpoints, and messages. And it was during this golden age of Star Wars pulp fiction that I really got into the franchise. I'd seen the original trilogy and the prequels were in theater, but what really made me fall in love with Star Wars was all of the stories in the background that built the lore, that built the world. I absolutely loved BioWare's Knights of the Old Republic. I loved the Republic Commando series novels. And the New Jedi Order was the first novel series I'd ever finished in my life. It was like 20 books or something crazy like that. And it took Star Wars in a completely different direction. But what always stuck out to me about this period of time were the writings of Timothy Zahn. He's the creator of the Thrawn trilogy, the original one and the new one. When the original one planted itself firmly atop of the New York Times bestseller list, George Lucas actually took notice and he realized that Star Wars fans, surprised, were starved of content. They wanted more. And in a lot of ways, this is what inspired the prequel trilogy. What made Timothy Zahn's work so interesting to so many audience members was it finally brought mainstream audiences into the shoes of Imperial soldiers and officers. Timothy Zahn's writings were also a bit more adult and nuanced in nature, dealt with more grayish shades of morality, like what you would see in real life. We were no longer given rebel propaganda pieces that vilified the Empire to the point of absurdity, and instead we uncomfortably started noticing that many Imperials, especially those who served beneath the more pragmatic Thrawn, were not just pure villains. Many of them, like Captain Galad Pellaeon, were portrayed as noble and honorable individuals. Of course, this was post-Battle of Endor, and the Emperor, with his dark side-addled brain, was no longer in charge of anything. This was really the introduction of a new Star Wars character type I like to call the Good Imperial. Some people might say that it's impossible for an Imperial to be good, especially after this faction blew up an entire planet. But I've always welcomed these type of characters, and that's because the Star Wars galaxy is one of the richest backgrounds in any fictional franchise, and so it really does deserve nuance in its characters as well. I've always believed that you can separate the individual from their ideology, find a thin line in which you can understand the humanity of an individual, even if they are working for a violent authoritarian state. I've always found the most problematic people are the individuals who don't understand this, that even in the most terrible organizations, you actually have human beings who might be relatable. And these individuals are usually too extreme or dogmatic to understand the true threat of the Galactic Empire and why they are so dangerous in the first place. It's the ability of these terrible regimes to actually attract decent people into their ranks, as in ordinary people that make up society. If the Empire were truly just a faction of evil clowns that killed everything in sight, their demise would almost be certain. Such a chaotic regime would never be able to sustain itself, and that's sort of how the Empire eventually collapsed towards the end. All the normal and decent people had left or defected or died, and all that was left were chaotic ass clowns. But at least in the Empire's earlier days, there were good people amongst the ranks. That is ultimately what is so terrifying about the Empire. Its appeal is wider than you think. More people, including intelligent people, can be swayed by their messaging. What was it that Padme Amidala said? So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. But yeah, when you have lore as rich and complex as Star Wars, with a world that is as massive and full of endless opportunities, it's almost insulting when you can't have more complex characters that don't fit into the cookie-cutter mold of space fascist or heroic rebel or evil space wizard and holy monk warrior. And so when Disney purchased the Star Wars franchise, I was actually pleasantly surprised to find that Disney would carry on this tradition of creating more grayish, characters from a morality standpoint. We have individuals like Admiral Ray Sloan, who fought her way through the vicious Imperial hierarchy to become a Grand Admiral. Post Endor, she was actually in charge of what was left of the Imperial remnant. You also had individuals like Sienna Ree, a brave and skilled TIE fighter pilot who also fought her way through the ranks. In her story, Lost Stars, we would see the destruction of Alderaan and the destruction of the Death Star through the eyes of Imperial soldiers and officers. And it is a very eye-opening account that really makes you kind of understand what is going on at this very critical moment in history. Even Electronic Arts would surprisingly contribute something positive to the world, something it rarely ever does anymore, by creating the character Iden Versio and Del Mico, two members of a special forces unit known as Inferno Squad. What makes these characters good is quite obvious. When you follow Iden Versio on her undercover mission to infiltrate the Dreamers, an offshoot of Saw Gerrera's partisans, you truly feel like she's attempting to do something good here. The Dreamers were formed after the death of Saw Gerrera on Jedha, and was made up of the most vile and chaotic members of the group that had survived. Whatever little restraint that Saw Gerrera managed to bash into these individual skulls was completely gone now. They were a full-blown terrorist organization, and now capable of the calamities I always knew they were capable of. Then we have the story of SP-475, Thara Nyende, a stormtrooper of the 97th Legion deployed in the capital city of Solis, Piñon. During her off hours between patrols, she would go to her uncle's cantina and deliver supplies and food for him to distribute amongst the local miners who were struggling to get by. Their wages were getting cut because of the Empire's intense military production needs. Thara did this knowing fully well that many of the people in her uncle's cantina were part of the Cobalt Laborers Reformation Front, a labor group that was vehemently opposed to the Empire and stormtroopers like her. Actually, now the Empire considered them a borderline terrorist organization. To walk that thin line, to do one's duty, but also treat the individuals who are supposed to be your enemy with respect, that makes Thara Nyende a good Imperial, albeit one that is in a space fascist organization. Now, we're not exactly sure what her own political ideology is, but it is difficult to understand that every one of her actions does help support the survival of the regime, especially because she's such a likable person. But why does Thara Nyende work as a stormtrooper? Well, it's because the credits are good. Born poor on a mining world like Solis, Thara Nyende had very few options other than to work in her uncle's bar or join everyone else in the mines. When the Empire came to town, as it did in many other areas of the galaxy, it basically destroyed all other industries and became the sole employer in town. And soon, the Empire would lower wages in order to decrease the cost of its, extremely plentiful military equipment, which was getting thrown away and lost at an incredible rate against the Rebel Alliance. As a stormtrooper, Thara earned twice as much as most of the workers around her, and therefore she was able to support her friends, family, and community with that income. A lot of good Imperials come from similar backgrounds like hers. They don't join out of ideology, they join out of necessity. They don't have a choice. Sienna Ree, for instance, was born on Jalukin in an extremely rural and impoverished village. Growing up, she hardly had enough to eat, and the prospects of her leaving this life behind was near zero. And so when there was an opportunity for Sienna Ree to join the local Imperial Academy and then eventually get recruited to the Royal Academy on Coruscant, she jumped at the opportunity not only because she could get 3, hot meals and some shelter, warm bed every day, but because this was a great honor to her family and to her planet. Not a lot of people made it off of Jalukin, and very few made it to the Royal Academy on Coruscant, which was like one of the best institutions in the galaxy. Ray Sloan came from a core world called Organthal that was rife with crime and piracy. At a young age, she ran away from home and was almost abducted by slavers. When the Empire came to town, the first thing it did was get rid of those criminal organizations, and that's what won over Ray Sloan's loyalty. Iden Versio's world of Ardos went through a similar transformation. It went from a backwater world that was rife with criminal scum to an imperial utopia after it was imperialized. And so when these individuals devoted their lives to the Empire, they bought into all of the talking points. They became extremely biased in how they interpreted the information that was being handed to them by the Empire. They started believing stuff like Alderaan had been harboring terrorists and therefore its destruction, while cruel, was necessary and designed to prevent future terrorist attacks. Sienna Ree, Iden Versio, Ray Sloan all had to play some pretty strong mental gymnastics to, live with themselves. And none of these individuals had any beef with Alderaan. They understood that the average Alderaanian was probably a good person, and they would ultimately justify the Empire's horrible action against Alderaan as a price one has to pay for peace and stability. It's a lie that Emperor Palpatine tells all Imperials, and it's a lie he'll continue telling all Imperials. And that's the thing. I mean, being a good person in an organization that has a terrible culture is ultimately going to end up poorly. The so-called political realists of today will oftentimes claim that only results really matter. And they're quite cynical about morality and ideology. They believe these things are just a game, and that's perhaps because that's how they operate, without a foundation based in any ideology or any type of morality. But when an organization is led by a Sith Lord who sees institutions like the judicial branch and Senate as impediments rather than the important checks and balances that they are, when a leader like Sidious replaces talented bureaucrats, politicians with psychopaths and sycophants and sets them against each other, that toxic culture becomes pervasive throughout the entire organization. And it leads to not just evil results, but just pure incompetence. I mean, if you look at most totalitarian dictators today, their economies are a mess, their societies are a mess, they're constantly fighting uprisings. Their militaries are usually incapable compared to free societies. It's quite obvious. And so yes, the Empire will get rid of bandits. It will kill pirates and keep some worlds safe. It will bring some profit to some individuals. But because its leadership and culture from the top is completely chaotic and has no other principles than to seize power for power's sake, the end result will always be horrific. To ignore the ideology of an organization that you join is something that is incredibly dangerous to do, yet human beings, since the beginning of time, have been doing this. I mean, post-World War II, psychologists, philosophers, sociologists all began to do studies to see why people do this. They asked the question, how many of us actually think for ourselves and how many of us actually just look for direction from others? And these studies all came out with really shocking numbers. Anywhere from 60% to 90% of people don't think for themselves. They're followers. And so the kind of people who join organizations like the Empire, they're not stupid. I mean, some are quite stupid, but a lot of them are also lazy, they don't care, or maybe they're just not courageous. Some are opportunists who believe that they can actually succeed in this kind of chaotic environment. Many actually do, because they are psychopaths. But here's the thing, when you don't think for yourself, when you join an organization simply because everyone in your town, your family, or your friend group has, and you don't truly understand what that organization is, and you're just doing it to fit in, somewhere down the road, you're going to realize that your own personal values are incompatible with the values of the organization you've dedicated your life to. This is what happens to almost the majority of the Good Imperials that I know, and it's incredibly sad to see it happen. They all usually end up running for their lives and defecting if they're able to. Iden Versio would leave the Empire after her own father orders her to partake in the destruction of their homeworld, Vardos, as a part of Emperor Palpatine's vindictive Operation Cinder. Lieutenant Gorn of the Aldhani garrison, who showed the local populace a great deal of respect and also commanded the respect of his troopers, would ultimately defect. Agent Callus, after being forced to survive with a Lasat rebel on an ice planet after their escape pod crashes, realized that the rebels cared for each other far more than the Empire ever would, and so he would become a double agent. But for some, like Agent Callus, they've already done horrific things in the name of this organization that they should have never served in the first place. Agent Callus, as a young, zealous Imperial officer, caused the genocide of the Lasat people. And this was driven by his own terrible experiences as an Imperial soldier. In one of Agent Callus's first patrols, he's ambushed by a Lasat mercenary who not only defeats his patrol, but also ends up shooting many of the wounded soldiers in his unit. Such is the chaotic nature of war. When emotions are involved, when you lose friends and family, it can change everything. It blinds you to reason. It doesn't allow you to see the other perspective. This is what happens to Iden Versio and Del Meeko's squadmate, Gideon Hask. When they defected, Gideon Hask tries to stop them. He remains loyal to the Empire because he had lost his parents to a rebel terrorist attack on the planet of Kuat as a youth, and he would never be able to let go of his hatred for the rebellion, and it would completely consume him. And so ideology does matter. The quality of the person in office does matter. The values of a political system also matters. You'll hear plenty of cynical voices on the internet say that it doesn't matter. And these individuals are actually in the minority. I think a lot of them are also foreign agents. They'll also make claims that, morality is relative, and, it's an easy claim to make when you're not the one being oppressed for your religion, your race, your political beliefs, your sexual orientation. You'll see people on the internet make endless criticisms about the Galactic Republic on the internet and defend the rise of the Empire as a good thing. But the truth is, the Republic, as flawed as it was, had principles worth fighting for. An egalitarian society, a fair society based on rules and logic, a system with checks and balances that prevents one part of the equation from becoming too powerful. It's a society that championed free trade, individual rights, and even with all of its corruption and inadequacies and incompetence, the Republic never destroyed the galactic economy. It never bought back slavery, carried out mass imprisonment campaigns to generate labor. The Republic would occasionally exploit planets both politically and economically, but never blew them up out of anger, like the Empire did. And that actually is a difference, and it's important, especially for the people on Alderaan, Jeddah, and Scarif. We never got a chance to choose the corruption of the Republic over the horrific destruction of the Death Star. Good Imperials who stayed in the Empire till the very end, like Rey Sloane and Ciena Ree, ultimately had to block out the evil actions of the organization they were fighting for. They maintained their own bubble of innocence by being the best officers that they could possibly be. They did their duty, treated the men and women they served with respect. And more importantly, they were very skilled and competent at what they did, and in positions of power where they could control their own future. But because the system that they were fighting for ultimately was designed to just satisfy the hubris and ego of one crazy Sith Lord, all of it was pointless. Ciena Ree would nearly lose her life during the Battle of Jakku, and Admiral Rey Sloane would disappear off into the unknown region with the Imperial remnants. By the time the First Order reappeared, she was nowhere to be seen, and gone was the culture of discipline, respect, and pragmatism that she worked so hard to create amongst her people. So many people always claim that the Empire could have been a great system if Emperor Palpatine hadn't lost his mind or if someone else was in charge, but the reality is, a system that is shaped like a pyramid will always be rife for power struggle. There is really no purpose in this system but to climb and to destroy your enemies. And that, of course, leads to incompetency at every level of governance. And so, of course, there are good Imperials. I mean, we should have the intellectual courage and discipline to see people as individuals and not just a member of a faction. Extreme rebel sympathizers who scream fascist at every opportunity are insufferable, and they oftentimes are just as extreme as the very people they're trying to destroy. And that is because they fail to see the individual and the reasons why they are the way they are. And when we lack empathy for each other, it's much easier to label the other as inhuman or something you can destroy, and therefore the cycle of violence will continue.